So as we're standing days before Tisha B'Av, already in the 9 days, it's very appropriate to be learning the life of Josephus, and especially the area that we're in, which is the attack and defense of the Galilee that came before the destruction of the Beis Mikdash itself, the Mikdash Sheni. Where we left off was that Josephus had been sent, along with two other Kohanim, Joazar and Judas, to the Galilee by the leaders of the community in Jerusalem. And really they were sent for multiple reasons. It appeared they were sent to create a defense of the Galilee. But they were also sent in order to take power away from the most zealous, and I use that word intentionally, zealous leaders in the Galilee who were threatening other Jews who wanted to make compromises with the Romans. There was a view held by large numbers of people that this is a war that we cannot win. And consequently, if we can find some kind of compromise where we have an element of autonomy and an element of justice, remember there were many different issues here. One of the big ones was that the Romans were showing, the local Roman governors were showing tremendous favoritism to non-Jews who were living in Israel over Jews, in terms of taxation, in terms of privilege. The second group that was quite privileged were the Sadducees, the Tzadduki, who were really wealthier. They tended to be people who owned large tracts of land, farmers, and the Romans kind of understood, we're upper class, you're upper class, we should have an understanding between each other. We don't have to have this unpleasantness that goes on. It's not a requirement. And then the other groups, like the Essenes and the Pharisees and certainly the Zealots, for one reason or another, had different levels of compromise that they were willing to make with the Romans. Josephus was sent to convince the people of the Galilee, the most zealous ones, that now is not the time to go to war. Right? Of course there will be a time. He didn't really believe it, but of course there will be a time, and we need to have our weapons in preparation and in the right hands when that time comes. So don't waste them at this moment. That was really the message that he was bringing. It's a little unclear whether it's entirely his own message, it would seem that way, or the message of the leaders in Jerusalem. The leader of the revolt in the Galilee was a fellow named, he was called by the Romans John of Giscala. Giscala was a place just a little bit north of Tiberias, which is where he came from, and he was a zealot. Right? He was a zealot, and he was threatening those who would not go to war, Jews who would not go to war. He saw them as, I think the word in the Second World War was quisling, the name of the Prime Minister of Norway, who Quisling, that was his name, right? And it's become a noun in the English language, which means somebody who is a collaborator with the enemy. And so anybody who is not, I'll save the story for later. Let me just make a note. It's a little bit off target, but it's interesting. Anybody who is not 100% willing to attack the Romans and others who would not support the war and be willing to give up their own lives was perceived by the Zealots as, if you're not with us, you're against us. Right? There were some people who said there are alternatives to war. Right? There are always, in these situations, all of these different camps, right? Some of them are traitors, right? But some of them are wise, and they're saying there's a time and a place. And it requires thinking out the situation. John of Giscala represented the most hawkish side of the revolt, right? So that's where we pick up, right? And it says, "But to this man how ill were his character and the conduct of his life, and how he and his brother were in great measure the authors of our destruction. I shall give the reader an account in the progress of my narration." So he's not going to go into detail here. And so that when justice had persuaded, by his persuasions, had prevailed on the citizens of Tiberias to take arms, and had forced a great many so too against their will, he went out and set the villages that belonged to Gadara and Hippos on fire. Okay, so justice is another name for John of Giscala. Right?
It means righteous? It means like a tzaddik?
It's just it's a Roman name. Right? It's John, Yonason, right? He's using the Roman name for him here. Right? And he's saying that there were people who didn't cooperate, weren't willing to go to war with the Romans, and he burned their cities down. He himself burned them down. Right? This is what we're being told by Josephus. Right? These villages were situated on the borders of Tiberias in the region of Scythopolis. Right? So just to remind everybody where we are here, if this is a map of the north, well, it's a map of the central, really. This is Engedi, and this is the Sea of Galilee. What? Kinneret, yep. Here is Tiberias at this point, okay? So just looking at this map, which might be a little bit clearer, right? Tiberias is here, right? And Scythopolis is here, and the cities that were burning were in this area, right? They were really kind of like suburbs from Tiberias, right? And Tiberias was a big issue, right? The people of Tiberias, it was already a sizable place. So when justice had, by his persuasion, prevailed with the citizens of Tiberias to take arms, so he'd convinced them to take arms, to take up arms in Tiberias, right? And had forced a great many to do so against their will, he went out and set the villages that belonged to Gadara and Hippos on fire. These villages were situated on the borders of Tiberias in the region of Scythopolis. So what he did was he forced the citizenry of the big city to rebel, and the suburbs who were unwilling to rebel, he burned them, right? And they were Jewish suburbs. And this was the state Tiberias was in, but as for Giscala, its affairs were thus. So he's going to say anything. So, okay, so here we are. The Romans are moving actively. The people of Tiberias are split. Some want to make peace with the Romans, some want to fight them, but they're all now viewed as at war with Rome because of this guy, right? Josephus arrives on the scene. When John, the son of Levi, this is still Giscala, right, saw some of the citizens much elevated upon their revolt from the Romans, he labored to restrain them. I'm sorry, this is actually John, the other Cohen that had come with him. Remember, two Cohen. He labored to restrain them, right, and entreated them that they should keep their allegiance to them, right, that they should keep it to yourself at this point. Right? But he could not gain his purpose, although he did his best. So the neighboring people of Gadara, Gabara, and Sogana, with the Tyrrhenians, got together a great army and fell against Giscala. right? So what's going on now is that allies of Rome are attacking not John of Giscala, but his hometown. Giscala is where he came from. That's why he's called Giscala, right? I'm called Ostriker because my family came from Austria. Okay. They took Giscala by force and set it on fire, and when they had entirely demolished it, they returned home. Upon which John was so enraged that he armed his men and joined battle with these people. They rebuilt Giscala after a manner better than before, and fortified it with walls for its future security. So you can follow what's going on here, right?
The people who attacked, they were not Jews, they were just inhabitants of
Giscala. They were not from Giscala. They were allies of the Romans. Certainly some of them definitely were not Jews. It looks like most of them were not. Most of them were not, right? But remember, the Romans were actively using divide and conquer, right? So they were actively using, you could become a Roman citizen through serving in the Roman army for 10 years. You could get the privilege of Roman citizenry, right? Some were forced to do this. Some chose to do it because in Rome it was good to be a citizen. There were many advantages to it. And they served, these soldiers who were not Roman by birth, right, served usually in the most dangerous positions, as you can imagine. Okay. So Gamala persevered in its allegiance to the Romans for the reason following. Philip, the son of... okay, so let me just tell you a little bit about these characters. I want to read you a little bit about some of the players that we have here, okay? I have some notes on it that I think you'll find interesting. So let's start with the main player, okay? John of Giscala, right? Okay. He's called Yochanan Migush Halav, or Yochanan ben Levi. He has a lot of different names, right? He's the leader of the revolt against the Romans in the First Jewish-Roman War, and he played a part in the destruction of Jerusalem in 770. So we're reading about him now in the north.
Role and destruction of Jerusalem?
He was part of the scene. Right? But we're reading about the early part of his career, really in 68, 69. Or, sorry. Yeah, 68, 69. He'll end up... Okay, let's see what it says. All right. As part of the Roman campaign to put down the revolt in Judea, Titus marched on Gush Halav, called Giscala by the Romans. Giscala was the last town in the Galilee not yet conquered. Outside the walls of the city, he called on them to surrender. John prevailed upon Titus not to enter the city that day, as it was Shabbos. Not so much out of regard for Shabbos as to his own preservation. He did this, says Josephus. Right? Why? Because that night, right? It's a little unclear whether they're talking about Friday night or Saturday night, by the way. If it's Friday night, it's even more interesting, right?
What happened?
John fled to Yerushalayim. And Titus was greatly displeased that he had not been able to bring John to punishment. He escaped him, right? Okay. He goes on to talk about what he did when he was in Jerusalem, and it was not a good situation. I'll hand it to you. Soon after his arrival in Jerusalem, he played an instrumental part in the outcome of the Zealot temple siege, handing the city over to the control of the Zealots. He attempted to set himself up as ruler in Jerusalem, but was challenged in April 69 by Shimon ben Bar Goria. Bar Goria was a leader of the, for want of a better word, the disenfranchised people of Jerusalem. He was a tremendously charismatic person. He was tremendously well loved, and he was the representative of those people who had very little. And he became a very attractive leader within Jerusalem, and more reasonable than some of the others. Right? So Giscala attempted to set himself up as ruler of Jerusalem, but was challenged by Shimon ben Guriah. They were both in turn challenged by a third faction led by Eliezer ben Shimon. Eliezer ben Shimon was a Tana. He was a master of the Gemara. He was there may have been two of them, but it seems one was of the generation of Rabbi Meir, the teacher of Rabbi Akiva, and one was of the generation of Rabbi Akiva himself, the next generation.
Same name, yeah?
Seems to be. It's a little unclear. It's a little unclear. Right? I would assume this one is of the generation of Rabbi Akiva. And they were both challenged by a third faction led by Eliezer ben Shimon. John and the Zealots fought a civil war with these two factions until he was finally captured by Titus, commanding the Romans during the siege of Jerusalem. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and taken back to Rome. He was paraded through the streets of Rome in chains. Okay? So that was the end of... okay? Ben-Guriah we've talked about. Okay, just a little bit about Justus, who was the Roman at this point, sir. Justus was born in Tiberias, a highly Hellenized Galilean city, and was a man of learning. He was close to the Tetrarch Agrippa and became a leading citizen in his hometown. Right? During the First Jewish-Roman War, he ran into conflict with Josephus, a Jewish leader in the Galilee. When the Romans had reconquered the Galilee, Justus sought sanctuary with Agrippa. Vespasian, who led the Roman troops, demanded Justus be put to death. So Justus became a zealous leader of the revolt. Right? He was appointed as a secretary to Agrippa, but later dismissed as unreliable. Now, he wrote a history of the war, Justus did, but it was destroyed. He blamed Josephus for the troubles of the Galilee. He also portrayed his former master, Agrippa, in unfavorable light, but did not publish the work until after Agrippa's death. Justus also wrote a chronicle of the Jewish people, from Moses to Agrippa, which also Josephus wrote. Both his works only survive in fragments. The Romans destroyed them. They only wanted one history at the end. Yeah. Right. Okay, finally, Shimon ben Eliezer, right? Who was in the middle of the struggle with Shimon ben Guriah, the leader of the common people, and John. Right? It says about him that his name is read Shimon ben Elazar. He was a Tana, a master of the fourth generation, and one of Rabbi Meir's disciples. He is cited in the Mishnah only a few times, but in the Tosefta and the Breitas, which was sort of outside the Talmud. It was comments outside the Talmud, but of the same time, contemporary to the Talmud. The portions that are quoted in the Talmud, his name is mentioned many times. In many of the classical texts of the Brisa, in matters in dispute, it was stated a different version of these disputes cited in the Mishnah. He most likely was the son of Rabbi Eliezer ben Shemua, who was one of the great sages of the Mishnah. Maimonides, when he enumerated the generations of the Tanaim, the sages, reversed the order and placed Rabbi Shimon ben Eliezer as a contemporary of Rabbi Akiva, whereas placing Rabbi Meir in the following generation. So it's a little unclear which one he is, but it seems to me, because of his behavior, he's most likely one of Rabbi Akiva's contemporaries at this point. So this is where we are. Now, I think the most important thing to understand about this, and I come back to this more than once, we talk about you cannot avoid going to a class on Tisha B'Av in which people will talk about Kamsa and Ben Kamsa, right? Bar Kamsa, right? And they'll point out that the reason given for the destruction of the temple, right, is, everybody knows, what's the phrase? Sinat Tinam, which means? Hatred for no reason. Unfounded hatred. Right? Okay. So for some reason that's what we choose. We don't choose the story, right? If your head is spinning by all these names that I've said, right, the one thing that you should get out of this is the Romans were in a great position because the Jews were fighting themselves more than they were fighting the Romans.
Right.
Left to their own position, they were killing each other. Sometimes in massive numbers, sometimes in individual numbers, and sometimes just assassination of leaders. Right? So I think this is a very, very, very important lesson, for us today.
Very much.
When we are in disarray because of sinat tinam, because of jealousies, because of all these things, we are unfortunately relatively easy prey
Vulnerable.
for our enemies.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And from a more spiritual, that's a tactical point, which is obvious when you read the story.
Mm-hmm.
But I think from a tactical point, or from a spiritual point of view, we're often described as the favored children of God. And I think anybody who is a parent knows that the most important thing in their family is that their children get along. Right? It's often said that a parent would rather the children like each other rather than love the parent. It would be more comforting to them if a choice had to be made. When God sees us in this kind of seething hatred, which is so bizarre when the threats are so great, it must pain him tremendously, I would think, and I think, we're, going through, sadly, many of these things again, at a very, very dangerous time. We have the state of Israel now. We didn't have it during the Shoah. And I pray that before we make statements that are divisive about other Jews, we rethink it. And I'm speaking, by the way, to myself as much as I am to anybody else. Because the quality of the Jew, I think, is that we all have very clear understanding of what the right path should be. Unfortunately, we don't all see the same path. Or maybe fortunately, I don't know.
Not only this, David, when we maybe not seeing the same path, or sometimes cannot control our evil inclinations or something, cannot control our characters.
Yeah, it might be simply evil inclination, but more often than not, I see in situations where I have a machloket with somebody that I think they generally hold what they believe, and they really believe I'm wrong. Mm-hmm. And this is on political issues. It's not on whose seat it is in the shul. This is on major political issues. And I believe with equal, shall I use the word zealotry, that the path that I see clearly is the path that Israel has to take, going forward. Maybe all of us should rethink how we approach our dialogue with one another about these kind of things. Maybe there are ways to find
You actually mentioned we didn't have Israel. In Josephus' story, we do have a country.
That's right. In Josephus' story, we have Israel. Today, we have Israel. In the Shoah, we didn't have Israel. And I should make one other remark, although it came to a tragic end. When the final piece of the revolt happened, a good 65 years later, ending in Betar, we were unified. We were very unified at that point. Now, part of it was that the Essenes and the Sicarii, the Zealots, and the Sadducees all were so connected to the temple that when the temple was destroyed in 62? 67, okay. When, I always have to make the same mistake. When the temple was destroyed, I think it was earlier, but we'll get to it. When the temple was destroyed, right, those elements of Judaism that were entirely connected to the temple basically disappeared. Not the people necessarily, but their ability to, if your faith is dependent on sacrifices in the temple, and there are no more temple, then where does your faith go? If your faith is dependent on the content of Torah, then the tragedy of the loss of the temple, and we should not diminish that tragedy. The temple was a place where miracles were witnessed every day. It was a place of unification for the people. There were many, many very important things that were lost when we lost the temple. But having said that, we didn't lose the Torah. So those people who would cling to the Torah, as well as the temple, only were halfway in the cold. They still had the Torah. Those people who said, the Kohanim will do the davening for us, and the sacrifices for us, right? And we'll go about our daily behavior, keeping the laws that we're told to keep. But our Judaism revolves around the temple, right? Those people were in big trouble when the temple was destroyed, from a spiritual point of view. So the consequence was that by the time the second part of the revolt happened, as I said, about 65 years later, right, that the only ones left standing from a point of view of theology, right, were the Pharisees. Right? Everybody else had been destroyed by the events that had preceded them. So the war against Rome, led by Bar Kokhba and Rabbi Akiva, was not like this one. There weren't the same kind of divisions. There were debates that went on among the Rabbanim whether we should go forward or not, and there were different views. But when the commitment was made that the revolt is happening, right, it went forward, and it was virtually unopposed within Israel at that time. And as we know, it had great success until Bar Kokhba began to exercise his own free will to do some serious damage, right? And that was the beginning of the fall of it. But it could have actually succeeded, unlike this one, which couldn't have succeeded. Yes.
So, if to apply modern question to those ancient Jews, those Pharisees, Sadducees, whatever, seeing the number of you mentioned, were they religiously different, more Orthodox, less Orthodox, black hats like today?
Yes. Yeah.
Or it was just social differences?
No.
Financially,
no, there were
theological differences.
There were.
If but you said several times that they were united by the temple, but were they exactly the same, or they differed in religious practice?
You're raising a contradiction that I should have spotted myself. When I said that the temple was an element of unity, right, it was an element of unity in that it was a central structure. It was the only place you could do sacrifices, for instance, right? Many things were unique to the temple service itself. Right? How to manage without the temple service, nobody could imagine. Nobody could imagine. The Pharisees had the tools to do it, but even they didn't imagine it. Everybody assumed that the temple would be forever. They prayed for it, even though it had been lost, but they couldn't imagine this, the tragedy of it. But when you ask the question, were they all saying the same thing in the temple and believing the same thing? Absolutely not. Questions, really big questions, like, the eternity of the soul. Right? The Sadducees didn't hold there was an afterlife.
Really?
At all. Yeah. You have to understand, and this is something to be very clear about, is that the afterlife, heaven and hell, reward and punishment in the next world, right, is not part of the Torah itself. There are some very subtle allusions to it. Bilam makes one in one of his blessings. Ironically, it doesn't come from a Jewish prophet; it comes from a non-Jewish prophet. But, and we should always have in mind that our responsibility is not to pray for the world to come, but to make this world a messianic world, to beat swords into plowshares, right? To do what we can to change this world. We're not people who say, I'll live my life, in the next world, it's going to be better, right? And the consequence of this is that the Torah spends very little. The prophets are a little bit different, the writings are a little bit different, but the Torah that Moshe wrote from God's words, right, has virtually nothing about the world to come. Nothing, right? So if you're somebody who doesn't hold by rabbinic interpretation, then you believe that there is no afterlife. It's not in the Torah, right? The prophets may allude to it, the writings, right? Or the mitzvot, or for what?
For this world. For this world.
For this world, absolutely. Afterward, right? We are a faith of deed. Deed. When you teach about, and there's reference to this in Pirkei Avos, that if your piety is greater than your deeds, you're in big trouble. Big trouble, right? If your deeds are greater than your piety, that's something you can work on. But the other way, not, right? So for reasons that are quite understandable, the Tzadduki held that there was but because they were literalists, in a sense, we all hold that the Torah is the Word of God. Right? But then the question is, does it mean that God created the world in 7 days? 7 24-hour days as we know them, right? That's a pretty tough one to buy into, right? Does each day represent an epoch? Does, time begin at a certain time? We spend a lot of time dealing with what was the meaning of the 7 days, other than 24 16-minute hours, right? The Tzadduki didn't. They said it was 7 days. There are, by the way, other fundamentalists alive today who hold a literal interpretation of everything, right? So when Shabbos came, on Friday night, they would turn the lights off, right? Because you're not to burn anything. They would put their fires out, and they would sit in the dark and eat cold food on Shabbos. So we have a tradition that dates from that we want to prove to the world we are not Tzadduki, that we are from a rabbinic tradition, because the rabbi said, no, that's not what God meant. And they have many proofs to prove it, the way the words are used, etc. When it says kindle no flame, it doesn't mean put a fire out. Exactly. It means don't start a fire.
Don't make a fire.
Don't heat a fire up. Right. Don't fan a fire. Right? But if you have a candle that burns for 2 days, put them all over your house and light them before Shabbos, and your house will be brightly lit. Right? If you have a stew that you can put on a strong fire, right? And when Shabbos lunch comes, you can serve this stew, right? Well, no problem with that. You can enjoy it. Huh? So to this day, there is a tradition which is a very powerful tradition, minhag, it's very close to a halacha that on Shabbos you're required to have something warm.
Right.
Right? Cholent is the most famous example of this.
Yeah.
Cholent is a food created to say to the world, I'm not a tzedukah. That was its purpose, right? I'm enjoying hot food in a brightly lit place throughout Shabbos, right? So, you know, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth meant to them, if somebody loses their eye, right, they should expect their eye to be taken out. Of course, we know that by the Pharisees, we understand that God said you should pay for the value of that eye.
Right.
If you've done something like that, it's going to cost you. But not this senseless
Literally understanding
vengeance. Doesn't make sense, right? So the answer is, yeah, there were some major differences theologically. The Essenes, based on the Dead Sea Scrolls, seem to have seen much more duality in the world than the Pharisees did, than Rabbinic Judaism did. You know, we hold that, you know, when you are an Eov says, what's going on here? And God says, do you have my thoughts and your thoughts? No. You don't have the scope of history that's going on. My decisions are made in a world that is beyond you. And it's difficult to accept. Very difficult to accept, and was for Job. But the result of for the Essenes was they saw a world of children of light and children of darkness, right? And in some ways it seems very non-Jewish, their beliefs, actually. So the beliefs were not simply, here's, yeshivish guy, and here's an Ashkenaz guy, and here's a Sephardi guy, right? These were very, very extreme differences. Because if you believe there's no reward and punishment in the next world, it may change things dramatically in your behavior. You can imagine, right?
You're telling me now that we have much less differences than they used to have?
Oh, yeah. For sure. For sure. Absolutely. And we have much less differences, by the way, than we had even 200 years ago. You know, the difference between the beliefs of Hasidim everybody was Orthodox in those days, right? Or Hellenist, right? Those were the two choices, right? But they were zealously Orthodox, all of them, right? But in terms of our differences, there are whole groups of Jews who really view themselves as Jewish much more culturally than religiously. Probably the majority of Jews today, sadly, have that view. So it's hard to argue what the differences in their belief system is, right? Because their belief system, even they would say, is not a particularly Jewish belief system.
But it means non-religious Jew would be much more accepting of everybody else. Whoever considers themselves Jewish, culturally Jewish, born from a Jewish mother, or even, connected through the father, they're much more inclusive than religious Jews.
Well, that shouldn't be. Yeah, I mean, you're making an argument, but of course, there are many. There are many people who only want to associate with people like themselves. And that can be, by the way, true with non-religious as well as religious. Be careful about generalizing too much. But, we understand from a halachic point of view, a Jew who is not a religious Jew is no less Jewish than a Jew who is, the Rabbi, at the end of the day. The fact that they are not practicing Judaism actively can have a lot of different elements to it, right? And at the same time, by the way, we should be very careful to be a little bit too full of ourselves if we're observant Jews, because being an observant Jew can be a very technical thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are specific rules you have to follow, but your behavior may be very inappropriate.
Absolutely.
Sometimes, and you're still, an observant Jew. So, this behavior that you're describing, right, I can only describe as most unfortunate, and we should know better.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's preferable to be a very accepting person of people who may not share the same observances as you do. I don't think it necessarily requires the individual person to become less observant in that process.
My question is actually connected with Israel now. They didn't have a hope of solving their differences. These four groups, Sakari, Essenes. We understand it was a different theology, it was power struggle, it was connection with Rome. What about now? We don't have such dramatic differences. We do believe in the same Torah.
Right.
We don't have a temple. Nobody does.
Right.
Nobody has.
Correct.
We live in a country, we have to defend it, we have to defend ourselves. If everybody at the end agree with that too, that you have to have an army. Are we in better shape than them?
I think we are. I think we are. Are there divisions? Most of our divisions come from a political and economic reality, in my opinion. Sometimes the divisions are covered over with many different passions. But I think in the end, they have to do with economy and power. And what I see happening in Israel, actually remarkably quickly. You know, we're talking about a country that is less than 70 years old. Remarkably quickly, there are common fronts being found. And I think that, if you had asked me this question 5-7 years ago, I would have been much less hopeful in terms of the issue that you're raising than I am today. I see many very positive signs, right? There are, no question about it, a certain group on different extremes that dig their heels in and will not compromise. But I think the center is growing constantly.
Very big division between ultra-Orthodox people and secular people.
First of all, I think that we hear the noise of it a lot. And by the way, less today than we did a year ago. I should add, I don't want to go into the details of the news of today because it'll be meaningless tomorrow,
right?
On KosherTube. But the trend is less of that noise. Maybe it's because the danger is greater. We often see, Shakespeare said that enmity cements a nation. And I think that we certainly have a full dose of enmity. For sure. Let's see if it's going to cement the nation.
Sure.
I don't want to think about what causes what and what the answers are. But what I notice is the headlines that I was reading, a year and a half ago are not the headlines I'm reading today about internal divisions.